Thank you, Rory, for the invitation and for the close association that you have and the college has with the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. I enjoyed your speech and also your op-ed to open this conference, and I see what you mean about the lights. Whoa. Let me recognise the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of these unceded lands, and also recognise other Aboriginal people with connections to the lands of the ACT and region. We are privileged to be on your country to benefit from the continuing culture and care you bring to this community. And thank you for the honour of addressing this National Security College Securing Our Future conference. We are in a very fine facility, but I still remember it affectionately as the site of the ANU student bar. And about 100 metres that way was the office I spent 3 years in writing, researching and writing my PhD. So I have an enormous amount of affection to be back here. I was asked to consider the future, and I think all of us, when we asked to consider the future, first reflect on the past. So I want to turn the clock back 40 years or so. It's 1983, I'm a student on this campus, and Justice Robert Hope is deep in the middle of an inquiry into the performance and accountability of Australia's intelligence agencies. It was in fact the second such Royal Commission he'd led in a decade. And at their heart, both the 1974 and 1973 and 1983 Hope inquiries asked a question that remains front and centre for everybody. How do we safeguard our national security without undermining the way of life that we're trying to protect? Justice Hope addressed the threats of his time, and these have only grown from extremism and terrorism to hacking and cyber attacks, from hostile foreign interference to conventional conflict, and the corrosive effects of misinformation and disinformation. There's been, of course, a commensurate increase in the tools and resources available to intelligence and security agencies to address these threats identified by Justice Hope. And these include, for example, foreign interference, espionage and border protection laws, control orders, advanced surveillance, information gathering, and data analysis capabilities. So what we see is effectively a constant rebalancing. As the scope and scale and sophistication of the threats evolve, so we hope agencies will develop an equally sophisticated response. Now, naturally, the accumulation of resources and powers that in pursuit of national security don't happen in a vacuum. There's a very important context around here. We're securing our values and our identity as a democracy and as a multicultural nation, and for good reasons, because greater fidelity to our democratic principles reinforces security. A more tolerant society is also more cohesive. Governance that's accountable gains stronger community acceptance and support. As Justice Hope made really clear, the preservation of our democratic way of life should be the overriding imperative. He confirmed absolutely the need for security services, but he wanted to give equal emphasis to scrutiny and accountability. And that's the important balance that I know you've been wrestling with in recent days. Work to safeguard democracy, recognition that accountability must apply to everybody with that mission. This is the touchstone of the national security community. Justice Hope's findings laid the foundations for the laws and the doctrines and the oversight arrangements under which intelligence agencies, and in fact the broader security project, operates today. And it is a complex community. It now has important accountability agencies, including the Office of the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, and more recently the Independent National Security Legislation Monitor. When Justice Hope produced his two reports, national security operated in a very different world. Remember when phones weren't mobile, when computers were as big as cabinets, and when mail was delivered to a letterbox. Without the convenience of emails and mobiles and encrypted messaging, coordinating people and groups, innocently or otherwise, was rather difficult. Back then, one of the principal tools of surveillance was the phone intercept, which is a laborious process involving physically installing an electrical intercept and then transcribing the amazingly tedious and irrelevant calls captured on the tape. Today, everywhere in the world is a mouse click away, and even thinly resourced entities, and instant or otherwise, can organise and operate transnationally. Australian-based individuals and groups can readily connect with like-minded counterparts overseas, sharing information and ideas. And this has been an absolute boon for business, for research, for cultural activities, for just about every aspect of modern life. But unfortunately, the same access is available for anyone with ill intent, and that can mean criminal gangs, terrorists, foreign states with a malevolent purpose. There are so many opportunities and so many potential avenues to use these resources. So Australia's National Security Committee has adapted. For example, the Australian Signals Directorate, ASD, collects and analyses enormous volumes of foreign data communications. It disrupts cyber-enabled crime. It leads the government's response to the growing number of serious cyber incidents. In a highly interconnected age, this is more than just protecting our information from hackers. It's about the integrity and availability of data and systems we depend on every day, from the internet and mobile communications to healthcare. And as we've seen in the conflicts underway right now, electricity, water distribution all become targets in conflict. ASD is at the core of a very significant expansion of the nation's cyber capabilities. Through Red Spice, which will expand the range and sophistication of ASD's intelligence, offensive and cyber capabilities, ASD will recruit an extra 1,900 officers over the next decade. This is a huge expansion of this core capacity. And it's just one part of the national intelligence community that collectively employs in the order of 9,000 people and brings together 10 agencies to protect and enhance Australia's security and our prosperity and our sovereignty. But of course, the collective effort on national security extends way beyond those that are formally part of the national intelligence community. Departments and agencies, including Defence and Home Affairs, and the Australian Federal Police and Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Attorney General's Department, the Treasury and the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, all host significant national security functions. And these often extend to policy, to regulatory and to enforcement responsibilities. And many areas of domestic policy, once thought of as at arm's length from national security, and I heard just then in the panel that yes, you can extend the national security envelope to just about anything, but today there is a significant national security overlay because we've seen the sort of attacks on the Australian Electoral Commission, on the Bureau of Meteorology, on the Reserve Bank, on Medicare, on Centrelink. And all of these institutions and lots like them are sources of national strength and resilience in times of crisis. They're all potentially vulnerable. And the same, of course, can be said for many sections of the private sector. The threat of critical infrastructure disruption is real and can have far-reaching consequences. Although it wasn't a malicious act, merely a greedy one, think about the widespread disruption caused by last year's Optus outage. Around 10 million customers, 400,000 businesses were affected, as were hospitals, public transport systems, payment systems, and importantly, calls to 000 for emergencies. As that incident highlighted, and as the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister said at the time, preserving and protecting national security inevitably is a whole-of-nation effort. So this increasingly challenging strategic environment creates some pretty thorny questions for legislators. Since the year 2000, so in the last 24 years, at least 124 Acts of Parliament relating to national security have passed in Australia. At last count, there are more than 3,000 pages of relevant legislation. There are 800 secrecy provisions. And every time an act is proposed, our lawmakers are presented with the same challenge: the need to strengthen national security, the need to remain true to our democratic values of openness and transparency and integrity, tolerance, human rights, and of course the rule of law. Inescapably, there's an inherent tension between protecting and promoting the rights of the individual and the collective interest of national security and public safety. And it is always, and always will be, a balancing act. Not easily achieved, often contested, hopefully always open to public debate. Let me offer two brief examples to illustrate this tension and the difficult choices that face lawmakers. One involves election campaign laws. Australia is highly and rightly regarded internationally for the integrity of our elections. The Australian Electoral Commission is regularly called on by international partners for advice and expertise on how to conduct reliable and robust elections. And we have seen internationally what it means in a nation when an election is contested, the validity of an election is contested. So to help ensure the fairness of our elections, there's a blackout on election ads on television and radio for the final 3 days of the campaign period, including polling day. That's meant to give people time to reflect, they've absorbed the lessons of the campaign, and now they have time to think before they have to make a decision. But the impact of the ban, which only applies to broadcasters, has been completely diluted by social media and the internet. While the clamour of political ads on radio and television falls silent in the final days of campaigning, online it's a completely different story. And there the messaging never stops. Now, the law does require that groups and individuals must put their names to internet advertising. But that's about the extent of the regulations. And that means there's nothing to present the most misleading and outlandish claims being made, and whether they're made locally or whether they're foreign interference. That is part of our now system. This may change. The Electoral Matters Committee of Parliament has pointed to truth in political advertising laws, but messages don't have to be overtly party political to potentially sway opinion. The spread of election-related misinformation and indeed broad disinformation online, much of it originating beyond our national borders, is worrying. And of course, while misleading political statements are nothing new, in recent years there's been attempts to undermine the confidence in the electoral system itself. So many of the critiques are there to imply that the election is somehow not fair, such as claims that unvaccinated voters won't be allowed into polling stations, or that ballots marked with pencils may be open to tampering, two very prominent messages that recently occurred. A task force brings together the Australian Electoral Commission and the intelligence agencies to help mitigate the risk. ASIO has and will continue to disrupt attempted foreign interference in elections. But the proliferation of false and misleading messages online has called into question the voluntary nature of the technology industry's code. Ministers have called for social media platforms to be more committed and active in policing what appears online. But of course, the challenge is how to do that without compromising freedom of expression. It is always a difficult tightrope to walk, a high wire act between the values of a democracy and threats to those same liberties. Another example is the tension between freedom and security, and is the treatment of violent or extremist material. ASIO Director General Mike Burgess warns that extremist online content can radicalise some people in a matter of days or weeks. Now, it's not illegal to hold confronting opinions, or as Mr. Burgess puts it, people have views that are, and I'm quoting Mike, are awful but still lawful. So any response must be sensitive to the right of free speech, something that's meant to distinguish liberal democracies like Australia from autocratic regimes. Yet recognise that those rights are constrained when exercising them harms others. So while Australians are free to hold whatever opinions they like, expressing them can be another matter. Words have consequences, and sometimes terrible ones. For this reason, there are laws against hate speech at federal and state levels. We can't just slander another person, we can't threaten them, we can't incite violence. So how, for example, to handle the act of viewing terrorist-relating material online? Britain has just made this a crime liable to a sentence of up to 15 years. And what of the changes made to Australia's criminal code in 2018, making it an offence to disclose or deal with any information made or obtained by an intelligence agency? The independent National Security Legislation Monitor, Jason Blight, held public hearings on those laws just last month. As he said, and I'm quoting him, "Secrecy offences have an important role to play in protecting national security. There is some information which, in the wrong hands, could genuinely harm those interests." But he went on to say, "We always have to balance this so that in empowering our national security, our police and law enforcement agencies to do this important work, we have always to be careful that the very democracy we are asking them to protect isn't undermined." So as independent monitor, Jake Blight makes clear the strain between necessary secrecy for intelligence agencies and our values and that make us who we are hard to reconcile. Justice Hope, back in 1983, said that balance was no simple or easy matter, but he believed, and I'm quoting, "in the final analysis, public safety and individual liberty sustain each other." But it's worth noting that this system, as substantial as its powers and resources are, is subject to significant degrees of scrutiny and accountability. Since the inaugural Hope Royal Commission in 1974, the intelligence community has been the subject of regular reviews, the most recently completed in 2019, the Richardson Review. Drawing on the Richardson Review, the government focused on strengthening oversight of the intelligence activities. Laws which implement the recommendations from Richardson to upgrade the functions and powers and operations of the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security and the powers of the Attorney General regarding ASIO were passed by the Australian Parliament last year. And there's currently legislation before the Parliament to enhance the ability of the Inspector General and the Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security to scrutinise all 10 agencies in the national intelligence community. These proposals would empower the Parliamentary Committee to request the Inspector General investigate and provide annual briefings to the Parliament. In addition, as part of the cycle of post-Hope evaluations, the government has commissioned the latest independent intelligence review. And this review has been asked to report on how well has the intelligence community operated within the recommendations from those previous reviews to support the nation's security priorities. It is due to report in the middle of this year. Such moves show that government and Parliament expect intelligence agencies to be held accountable. And there are also oversight mechanisms in place for the other departments and agencies involved in protecting our national security, including the one that I'm honoured to lead. Each of those agencies is subject to the strictures of the Public Service Act and the Public Governance, Performance and Accountability Act, as well as to direct parliamentary scrutiny. Such supervision needs to be as transparent as possible, consistent with justifiable conditions around operational confidentiality. We need intelligence and security agencies to have the powers, resources and capabilities they need, and we need to make sure that accountability occurs so that the powers they exercise are appropriate and proportionate. Now, much of this does happen in the public sphere, thanks not just to the formal scrutiny bodies, but to parliamentary committees and to agencies themselves, to external agencies, to civil and society groups, to the media, and to conferences like this one. In a democratic society, one that treasures the rule of law, this is as it should be. We need a constant conversation about the role of the national intelligence community, because its role must change as public expectations and new technologies and, alas, new threats emerge. One important innovation arising from a recommendation of the 2017 Independent Intelligence Review was the evolution of the long-standing work of the Office of National Assessments to create the Office of National Intelligence, or ONI, with a mission and autonomy set out in legislation. ONI leads the national intelligence community, with the Director and General Intelligence appointed as the principal advisor to the Prime Minister on intelligence matters. O&I has an evaluation role. It oversees a fund designed to foster collaboration and integration across the community. So I've looked back at the past because it helps us think about the future. And if we look over those 40 years, what we see is pretty continuous evolution of Australia's intelligence community and indeed the broader apparatus of security. As the 2024 ASIO threat assessment makes clear, constant adaptation reflects the fact that we live in just extraordinary constellation of changing risks and threats. And the nature of those are necessarily a far cry from those confronting Justice Hope. New issues, however, play into the themes that he established. Hence, malicious cyber activity has become a significant area of concern, but its aim is all too familiar. It's espionage, it's foreign interference, it's threats to crucial infrastructure in times of crisis and conflict. And while much of the focus remains on state actors, recent experience stresses the threat from highly organised ideological groups and even motivated individuals. So the size of the task facing the community is formidable, but so is our expertise across the national intelligence community. There are thousands of Australians contributing their working lives to responsibilities they can't discuss with their friends and family. We're working to stop something happening may be the most important contribution they ever make and one they can never discuss. It's a community in which values matter. And I know from many conversations with intelligence community leaders that there's recognition that the demands of national security must always be balanced against the values and freedoms that make us a vibrant democracy. Mike Burgess, for example, says that in tackling security threats, I quote, "It is right we consider civil liberties and keep under review the right mix of powers to protect people's rights and the safety of the community." He argues that far from being contradictory, protecting security is complementary with the rights of citizens to privacy. ASIO, he says, is committed to safeguarding the security of Australians and their liberties, protection from wrongs while securing their rights. This inherent tension can create chafing on both sides. Citizens worried about privacy, intelligence agencies dealing with restrictions imposed in the name of individual rights and democratic values. Yet, at least in my experience, there's widespread recognition of such limits as legitimate, agreement that security and accountability are necessary democratic checks. So, by the time that next independent intelligence review rolls around in 5 years or so from now, the world and its threats will have changed again. But on the track record of the last 40 years, we can predict with some confidence that the wider intelligence and security community will have pivoted to those changes, just as it has through the decades. The tension will remain, but still understood in the context of the outcome we all want: a safe and secure Australia in which intelligence plays a vital role, with a national intelligence community that lends all of its considerable expertise and heft to living and supporting our democratic values. Thank you.
I've secured your future, so that's a win. Look, thank you very much for that, Professor Davis. And I know we've just got time for a couple of questions. We also have some closing remarks for the overall conference. But I just briefly wanted to put your speech just now in broader context. So, and the broader context, of course, is that you're the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. You have not only visibility, but you have a fundamental role in the crafting and implementation of policy across the full agenda. I want to come back to national security, but I would be very interested just to get your encapsulation of the national policy agenda of this government, and perhaps then we can talk a little about where security fits in. So we're almost 2 years into this government. What's the agenda?
Thank you. So let me step back one step before coming to that, about the challenge for every government, regardless, and not just in Australia. And it was captured brilliantly by English conservative philosopher Michael Oakeshott 50 or so years ago. He said that in political activity, men of the period sail a boundless and bottomless sea. There's neither harbour for shelter nor floor for anchorage, neither starting place nor appointed destination. The enterprise is to keep afloat on an even keel. The sea is both friend and enemy, and the seamanship consists in using the resources of a traditional manner of behaviour in order to make a friend of every hostile occasion, which is a way of saying there is no destination for a country. You're not heading in a particular way. You're actually trying to ensure that this country has a long-term future without knowing what that can be, and you're trying to sail through seas where there are potentially hostile places. You have two obligations. The one is that the ship can keep sailing, so that's a domestic obligation, and the second is the international one of looking out to make sure that you understand your position in the world and that you're negotiating it constantly. That is the existential requirement. That is the existential requirement of every government in every nation, and it's as true for us now as it was when it was written. So I always try to understand government in terms of that objective. You've got a whole lot of domestic issues which are not just about prosperity and opportunity, but go to fairness and equity and the objectives, and those domestic priorities change from time to time. And then you have international priorities which change with the circumstances but are sometimes much less contested. In part because the circumstances tend to dictate the choices. So this government has been very clear about its sort of four big goals, which I'm just quoting the Prime Minister: the cost of living relief, strengthening Medicare, a future made in Australia, which is about industrial strength, and then the final, and one I guess most relevant for here, is safe at home, secure in the world. And there I'm just quoting something the Prime Minister said in an op-ed. So those four things give you a sense of the sort of big national priority.
Okay, so I mean, if we're breaking it down, security gets 1 out of 4. But I know that it doesn't quite work like that when you're looking at policy from a whole of government perspective. So I think it would be interesting to get a sense of whether it's how you, as Secretary of Prime Minister and Cabinet, or whether it's how the government as a whole sees national security as an objective, and perhaps where that fits within that broader program. For example, we've talked a lot here about, and in your speech you've addressed the question of how do you manage the trade-offs between security and the other good, important things, manage them, reconcile them. So it would be useful to get your security perspective.
Thank you. So I might address this, if I may, by talking about something that's not much discussed in public, and I'm certainly not going into any area of confidentiality, but it's well known that there's a meeting called the Secretary's National SCONS, as a National Security Committee, and it meets fortnightly, sometimes more often, and it's my great honour to chair that committee. In the room, in a secure room, are the heads of each of the key security agencies, the heads of the Defence Forces, the head of the Australian the Federal Police, often the head of Sovereign Borders, Operation Sovereign Borders, and then the secretaries of some key agencies that have a national security interest or just are important in the conversation: Treasury, Finance, and so on. The agency that oversees all of our energy supply, for example. And every fortnight, at least, that group of people spends several hours working its way through the key national security issues in front of the government that need discussion on their way to NSC, which is the National Security Committee.
There's another NSC. I'm horrified.
There is. And that NSC is a long-standing, it's run for 40 or 50 years. Regardless of the government, it's a very important forum in which national security issues are handled. Now, the point about the SCONS meetings is not only are they fascinating and in-depth, but there's a sort of ethic of role there. You're not there to stress your own opinions on the issues that come up. Nobody's interested in you're there to speak for the expertise of the agency, that you're there to speak for the perspective that you need to bring to this matter. And what they create over time is a group of secretaries and agency heads who understand each other, who know what the points of view are, because they're very lively, often frank, and often there are disagreements, and that's exactly as it should be. So across government, across the leadership of the public sector, you have agency heads from the intelligence community who get to hear from the head of Treasury and the head of finance. They understand the budget context. They understand a lot of the domestic policy matters that are driving the government. And in turn, those secretaries get to hear every fortnight and in detail from the people who have the direct operational responsibility for our national security. That sets up a conversation inside the federal government that I think is powerful and enduring. It has been so for a very long time. Regardless of who the government of the day is, it does ensure a well-connected understanding of the national security priorities across the government. And it's also a fascinating collection of some very intelligent and very well-briefed people.
Can I just push it one little bit further, and then we'll have to wrap up? That's, if you like, the resolution, the trade-offs, the management at the level of the leadership of the public service. When it comes then to the reconciliation and the trade-offs within government at the executive level, how does it translate? It's surely not always seamless.
No, nor should it be. I mean, the whole point of a democracy is that you can debate issues, you can hear points of view, and you can, in a sense, a majority view holds. So one of the people I failed to mention in that sconce meeting is the head of the Attorney General's department, a department that has a very keen eye to exactly the questions you've just raised, just as the Attorney General is in the National Security Committee and has a keen eye to the issues you raise. These things get identified and debated. That idea that there's tension between what in an ideal world you could do unconstrained and what in the practical world of where we exist balances the contending views is how the system is designed to operate and operates, I think, with some success. And it's not a recent thing, and it's not down to the chairing. It's actually down to the fact that it is set up so that contending views can be heard, and where reconciled, as they often are, you get to a point. But in the end, if you're the cabinet, if you're the National Security Committee or the cabinet, you have to finally make a decision. And so the whole process is designed to put in front of the decision makers, who are the elected politicians appropriately, all the information they need, including what are the trade-offs that are being accepted as part of this, in order that they can make an informed choice. And in a sense, what you're looking for is a degree of rationality in the policy circle, not pure rationality, but rationality that you've worked your way through these questions before you hit on an answer. And that is what I see week after week, first in SCOMS, up to NSC, and then finally in Cabinet.
Look, thank you very much, Secretary. I think that this conference has served multiple purposes, and one of which, quite shamelessly, we're generating material that our students, I think, will find useful in years to come as they try to make sense of the policy process. So I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for your speech. I want to thank you for the relationship that the National Security College has with government through the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Thank you again.